Thank you all for being here today. It was very exciting to hear about all the positions that you have undertaken in your pursuit of public interest law. I was in your sort of place only a short time ago, about 30 years ago, and I can still remember it like it was yesterday. Public interest law has provided me a wonderful career. Every day is a new adventure, and I just hope that you will all stay with it over the long haul. There's a lot of work to be done. So, as you heard in the introduction, I'm an attorney that represents people with serious mental illness and who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, and I've done so over a span of 30 years. Almost 9 years ago, when I was sort of taking up space at an office when I was getting this project underway, I came across a handout that came through on the copy machine about ASAs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it looked really interesting to me, and I grabbed it and went back to my office and read over it. And I was so intrigued because it helped make sense of so many of the stories I heard on a daily basis since the 80s, since I started working with people who were homeless and very poor, first on the West Coast and then here in Chicago. So the ASA study was a study that occurred between 1995 and 1997. It included over 17,000 participants, and it looked at the connection between adverse childhood experiences and adult health outcomes. And the ASA study looked at, in terms of adverse childhood experiences, it broke it down to abuse, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, witnessing domestic violence, experiencing parental separation or divorce, growing up in a household where you have an adult parent or adult guardian who is mentally ill or substance addicted or is sent away to prison. And so what they did in this study is it was a survey, and they studied adults and asked them to report on whether they had any of these adverse childhood experiences. And what they found is the higher the ACE score, the more impactful in terms of negative health consequences in adulthood. The higher the ACE score, the more chronic medical conditions, the poorer physical health, the greater likelihood of serious mental illness, the greater likelihood of substance addiction. What the study showed is that what happens in childhood that is adverse to you impacts adult health. And in fact, they found that people with ACE scores of 6 or more actually had a mortality rate. They lost 20 years off their lives. It's very, very profound impact. So the adverse childhood experiences, you can Google ACEs, and there's sources at the end of my PowerPoint. There has been so much additional research, but this is really landmark medical research. Since that time to the present, there has been just tremendous amount of research and development looking at adverse childhood experiences, as well as additional adult trauma. So I realized as I was getting ready for today's presentation, I hadn't put in definitions of trauma in the materials, because usually I have a clinician who does a presentation before mine about what trauma is. So just briefly, I want to talk about, introduce you to the concepts of definition you'll find of trauma when you sort of delve into this research, or so you have a working vocabulary about trauma. So there's individual trauma that we're all probably familiar with. You could have a car accident or witness something that's very scary. It's any event or a series of events that is experienced by an individual, either physically, emotionally harmful, or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. Sort of a basic definition of trauma. That's out of SAMHSA definition. The SAMHSA website, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, has wonderful materials on trauma. Beyond individual trauma, there's complex trauma, and that's defined as multiple and or chronic and prolonged developmentally adverse traumatic events, most often of an interpersonal nature, such as sexual or physical abuse, war, community violence, and early life onset. So when you hear people refer to complex trauma, that's generally something that's been people that have been exposed to in childhood. It's often within a child's caregiving system, and it includes physical, emotional, and educational neglect, and child maltreatment, again, all beginning in childhood. Then there's another definition or a terminology you'll hear of polyvictimization. And the handout that I made available to you today, we'll try to apply it later in my presentation to some real life client examples. But that's a really good, it has a checklist of traumatic experiences. Polyvictimization is about when individuals are exposed to multiple types of victimization, and they tend to experience greater health and emotional problems and greater re-victimization than others. Even those with repeated exposure to one type of traumatization. So it's like polyvictimization is people that have experienced a variety of different traumas. Maybe, but like in my caseload, I work with a lot of people who've had significant adverse childhood experiences. They've been on the streets a significant time and exposed to additional adult trauma. They may have come from a community area of Chicago that is essentially a war zone. So they've been exposed to a tremendous amount of community violence. So many of my clients have experienced polyvictimization. So in addition to the research about ACEs and trauma, research has gone on to focus on the impact of trauma that is beyond the individual. There's evolving research around intergenerational trauma, sort of an affective component to trauma in family units where parents who have been experienced trauma pass that on either environmentally or in an affective way, how they deal with life to children, and this can go multi-generation, as well as what's called behavioral epigenetics, where they look at how trauma impacts the brain, just chemically how trauma can impact us. And it can be passed on through generations. And so it's in theory and becoming more and more recognized that trauma can be passed on through generations, and it really can bequeath to you either sort of anxiety or resilience. The upside is that research is showing that with brain plasticity, we can help our brains heal into adulthood, but the impact of trauma is really profound. And you'll see it when you're working with clients, both individual, you'll work with whole family units that are all impacted by trauma, and you'll work with community areas that are collectively impacted by trauma. So when I came across this ACE literature 9 years ago, and then started doing additional research and sort of applying it in practice, it was so resonant to me because, and I think more and more, the more I think about it, the more I integrate it into my practice. Being a poverty law lawyer and thinking about poverty and what we do about it, so much is in the history of the States and in humankind, we've often looked at people as the deserving or the undeserving poor. And trauma research sort of helps us to shift out of that and away from sort of deserving and undeserving poor to a more neutral, universal public health policy inquiry, one that asks, not what is wrong with you, but what has happened to you? What have your experiences been? And I think it's transformative. The original ASA study was, interestingly, among a very privileged group. It was mostly white, mostly educated, mostly had private insurance. So since ACEs, as I've said, there's been additional studies. There's more studies that focus on minorities, urban communities. There's additional studies looking at expanding, so they call what expanded ACEs. So if you do research and you think about applying this research into your practice, they're looking at the experience of bullying, which you're hearing a lot about nowadays, living in unsafe neighborhoods, witnessing community violence. And so the research is just, it's tremendous. ACEs are common. 60% of adults report being impacted by ACEs, and studies show a dose-response relationship. The more victimization, the more trauma you experience, the more you're going to be affected physically, socially, and emotionally in adulthood. I keep it wrong back here. So there's a clear connection in the research between childhood trauma and serious physical and mental health conditions in adulthood, including substance abuse and suicide. Serious mental illness diagnoses associated with childhood trauma include depression and anxiety disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders, dissociative disorders, and psychosis. If you focus only working with people that come to you or that you suspect have a post-traumatic stress diagnosis, you're going to miss the vast majority of clients who have been impacted by trauma. I find in my practice that PTSD diagnosis is very rare, and yet most of my clients are impacted in a very significant way by trauma, complex trauma, polyvictimization, et cetera, but they won't carry a PTSD diagnosis. the number of other serious mental illnesses they may be diagnosed with. So, and adverse childhood experiences and childhood trauma increases the likelihood of learning and behavioral issues, and of course that increases the likelihood of criminal justice involvement when kids are counseled or tossed out of school or don't do well in school, and eventually leads to risk of poor work performance and of course financial stress. A really very personal and public example of somebody who's bore the brunt of complex trauma is a tragic story of LaQuan McDonald. When you read the young man that was shot multiple times by Chicago police, right? If you read his biography, he was given birth to by a teenage mother. His father was not available to him. He moved 5 different homes and in and out of the foster care system. He, I think, at one point shared how smoking pot helped him reduce sort of the stress and feel more normal and human and relaxed and feel better about himself. But of course, that leads to criminal justice involvement and eventually led to his death. And if Mr. McDonald had not been killed by police, he very likely would have showed up in my caseload or some of yours later in life, because I work with LaQuan McDonald's every day, those who have survived so far, but are really, really suffering the effects of complex trauma. So, trauma, when it impacts, when you experience it in childhood, and it starts manifesting right at school, and kids don't do well, and then it leads to addictive behavior or high-risk behaviors, and that leads to criminal justice involvement. And often because of the intergenerational trauma, you're working with people who are involved in the DCFS involvement. And that limits, of course, what people can do in terms of securing jobs and being paid a living wage. And that, of course, puts people at risk of homelessness. And the greater the trauma in childhood and adult trauma, the earlier mortality people experience. And of course, what else it does, if it doesn't kill you, it causes you to be poor, results in very high poverty rates, and makes you eligible for legal services, which is, of course, why you're all here and why you need to know about the impact of trauma and how to integrate it into your practice. So, hold on just 1 minute. On the impact of trauma and how, originally I would say the research around trauma focused mostly on pediatrics, on children, on what can we do now to stop the long-term effects of trauma, right? So originally, that's why it took so long, I think, for it to cross my desk and for me to be, because I always work with adults, was to really think about, I mean, there's so many children currently today that are being impacted by trauma. We want to get it into what we can to stop what we know will be a trajectory of poor adult health and wellness outcomes. But also, what do you do with the number of adults that are on the street, right, or living in substandard conditions and living difficult lives because they've been impacted by trauma? So the first line of defense was sort of educational healthcare providers and schools. Paper Tigers is a wonderful documentary, if you haven't seen it, that I'd highly recommend about the impact, a school that tried to integrate a trauma-informed approach into a high school setting. And it was a really wonderful documentary, and I think it calls for a trauma-informed approach in all educational settings. The American Academy of Pediatrics, if any of you are in placements where you're working with children or intend to pursue careers working with children, the American Academy of Pediatrics has wonderful materials. So when you think about legal contexts in which trauma is relevant, it's really everywhere. You can think about in terms of healthcare access, because people with trauma histories have significant healthcare needs with serious medical conditions, chronic medical conditions, higher rates of serious mental illness, addiction disorders, they're going to need access to healthcare. So in all healthcare related fields, whether you're helping individuals secure insurance benefits or you're working for a hospital on compliance issues, thinking about how trauma impacts the health and well-being of your clients is significant. Of course, as I already mentioned, education and school-based reform efforts the socioeconomic impact of educational failure is so significant and so frightening. Ignored and misunderstood trauma in childhood years is really going to be impactful on that child for the lifetime. So attorneys involved with kids, special education placements, IEPs, school-based reform efforts, you really have to take what we know about trauma and the impact of trauma very, very seriously. In the juvenile justice and criminal justice systems, right? It's been integrated to a certain extent in some programs, nationally, in terms of diversion, mitigation, and sentencing. You can think about so many ways. There's now a mental health court operating right at Cook County. Our prisons and jails in Illinois are our biggest mental health hospitals, and they really should be trauma informed, and certainly trauma should be considered in any sort of sentencing and in criminal justice. Family law and child welfare contacts, rather than terminating parental rights or terminating contact, there's some evidence that connection with needed services and added supports may be more helpful in assisting youth overcome the adverse effects of custody disputes and child welfare involvement. Discrimination in employment and housing. You could even think how trauma would be relevant there. A person with significant trauma history can be more susceptible to a hostile work environment. Trauma survivors whose symptoms are severe enough to constitute a disability may require reasonable accommodation in housing and in employment settings that's specifically sensitive to trauma symptoms. Domestic violence proceedings, a trauma-informed approach would aim to keep victims safe, but also address the impact of trauma on the children, of being witness to violence and being dislocated by violence. And if appropriate in domestic violence, trying to get services to the perpetrator of violence, collectively addressing trauma in the whole family unit. As well as disability proceedings, which has been the vast majority of my work in the last 8 years, where certainly trauma is highly relevant because the medical condition of my clients is very, very relevant. So it's a part of the narrative and story and inquiry in every client matter that I'm involved in. But any sort of disability proceeding, whether it's under state law, health insurance, the Social Security Act, workers' compensation cases, personal injury, any area of law that calls for the assessment or evaluation of a person's function or injury where a serious trauma history impacts a person's health, wellness, resilience, and potential for recovery. Because a trauma history will impact both, for example, on serious mental illness. There's research that shows trauma history makes it more likely that the symptoms of serious mental illness are more severe and more intractable, more difficult to treat, more long-term, more chronic. So many, many contexts where trauma is an imperative part of your practice and focus and integration into both individual client services and law reform efforts. And if you miss it, there's trauma-informed lawyering and trauma-informed care in both healthcare, school, and justice settings takes very seriously how pervasive trauma is and sort of adopts from the public health field an assumption that everybody's impacted by trauma, so the first principle is do no harm. So come at every client, every case, every matter as if people are impacted by trauma and you don't want to do any further harm. If you don't address trauma, you can get, I have to say, after learning about the trauma research, for 30 years I've worked with so many people that were misdiagnosed as bipolar illness or major depression, who really had very complex trauma histories. People that have been put on very significant psychotropic medications with horrible side effects because they weren't properly diagnosed. And so when people are misdiagnosed or trauma ignored, when people are non-compliant, and you'll get this in poverty literature and narrative all the time, they're non-compliant. Why do they keep using cocaine? Why are they using heroin, right? Well, it's not non-compliance, it's adaptation to trauma. And so, or a response to being misdiagnosed. So I'll have many claim the Social Security disability realm, compliance with prescribed medical care is very important in winning your case. Social Security looks at whether are you disabled or not, and are you following prescribed treatment. Well, if the diagnosis is wrong and the treatment is ineffective, then my client's going to be harmed by being called non-compliant, and the real problem is that they've not been properly diagnosed and are not being properly treated. Also in public benefits, across the board, you can have people losing shelter services, social services, access to legal services in all of your programs, because there's not enough free legal services or low-cost legal services to go around. Who often gets cut out? You know, those clients that are the hardest to serve. People with serious mental illness, people with co-occurring disorders, people who miss their appointments, who come late to their appointments, who don't bring in the proper paperwork. And those, in my opinion, are the people most impacted by trauma. And every legal service program in Chicago, statewide, and in the country needs to be trauma informed. We need to not be cutting these people out of our lives. We need to be bringing them in closer. So if we don't approach our work with a trauma-informed orientation, we run the risk of further traumatizing our clients and our client communities. Trauma is not only, I work with a lot of clients who are not only impacted by trauma being the victim of trauma, but also the perpetrators of trauma. I work with a lot of people who are ex-gang affiliated. I work with people who are registered sex offenders. And the impact of their trauma being, trauma can be, you'll work with people who have both been impacted by being the victims of trauma and have been impacted by trauma by being the perpetrators of it. It's complicated. As I gave the example of LaQuan McDonald and his mom who had challenges and his dad was unavailable. Both his parents could have been my client. There's trauma is just so everywhere. People have experienced it in many, many different ways. So it's important to note, though, as I say, trauma is like so impactful and it's everywhere. It certainly may or may not impact health outcomes. Not everybody's the same. Somebody can give me a trauma history, and for some reason, we're learning more about the research on resilience, they do okay. I mean, there's famous stories like Oprah Winfrey, right? Has significant trauma history, but she's made it. There's many people who overcome trauma. Not all trauma causes poor adult health and a difficult life, but much of trauma does. So it's important not to be uniform. Oh, if you're a trauma survivor, you must have symptoms and you must need special care. Not everybody is the same. People experience it differently, and most of the research is focusing now around resilience. People that have cultivated resilience have 1 to 3 adult caregivers in childhood, some stability, superior intellect, some talent can help people sort of inoculate them against the long-term effects of trauma. Okay, so trauma-informed care in sort of the non-legal setting generically is an approach to engaging people with histories of trauma that recognize the presence of trauma symptoms and acknowledges the role that trauma has played in their lives. Hopefully by now you know what trauma is, and I convinced you it's very impactful. The way I've integrated it into my practice is, one, understanding the powerful and varied effect of trauma. I do research all the time about trauma, about symptoms of trauma, how it affects people, understanding and the impact both at the client and community level, the historical level. Engaging clients in a way that facilitates full understanding of and appreciation for each client's trauma history. That's to point out it's very individualized. We can't make assumptions that every client's experience is the same or that every client will respond to trauma in a similar way. Everybody's has their own story, and we have to listen for it. And then accommodating the current reality of our clients and advancing their personal legal goals. This is about being very mindful about what your client shares with you about their trauma history, being very mindful about what you understand your client's symptoms of trauma are, and which we're going to talk about in a minute, and then accommodates with their current reality. A very clear-cut example is I have some clients who are so impacted by their trauma history, but are at a place in their recovery where they're ready to tell their story. They want to be in front of a judge. They want to tell their story. Similarly, I have clients that are not there in recovery. They're so horrified and embarrassed and traumatized that they can't tell their story. The thought of having to be in front of a judge and talking with strange people in the room and share any part of their story is just horrifying to them. So it's about listening to your client and trying to accommodate what both their personal and their legal goals. So for those clients, one, I would try to do everything I possibly could so she or he did not have to testify, do everything on paper. Do advanced arguments to the tribunal to say this is not, understanding what the trauma impact here. We want to try to do everything we can without this person having to testify. And the other, I've taken clients to hearings where I thought we don't have a right case. We probably can't win it yet. But in a trauma-informed approach, it was important for them to go forward. They needed to tell their story. I thought we might still lose on the heroin addiction part, but it was important for their recovery at that moment in time to go forward with the judge, and we do. So it meets clients where they are, recognizing there's a lot of differences. And then the third prong of trauma-informed lawyering is trying to work, of course, for systems reform, more just laws and fair application of the law. In my practice, it's looking at the Social Security disability determination process and saying, you know, trauma research has to be integrated here. There's no voice, there's no vocabulary, there's no language. And so always in my legal briefs and in my presentations in court to judges, I'm trying to educate them about the impact of trauma and understanding why it's relevant. It's it's been very, very helpful in terms of closing the gap in credibility in many of my cases, and dealing with in disability, Social Security disability cases, the issue of materiality of substance use and dependent. But we're trying to work on federal law that would, you know, integrate trauma awareness, what we know about it, into the substantive law. But there is so much room because trauma really has not been well integrated. We want to look at systems reform. So I gave you a handout identifying trauma exposure and symptom. We talked about what trauma is and how impactful it is. Trauma, sometimes you will hear from your clients, and sometimes you can develop it from, if it's necessary, from case, from discovery, from materials, from medical records. Not everybody has to tell their trauma stories. Being trauma-informed with some clients, I can detect from hearing what they're sharing with me that there's some significant trauma background. And I'll generally invite the client, I'll ask them, you know, have you told this story before? Is the information that you're alluding to or you've shared to some degree in a document anywhere? Would you be more comfortable if I gather that information and then we would not have to go through this experience? So this handout, I think, is really, really helpful. We're going to apply it in just a minute to a client's example because it gives you a checklist of common traumatic experiences in people's lives, trauma symptoms, and then trauma responses. So you have that handout. But as I, over the years, have, you know, we all work too many hours, have too little time to meet all the client needs that we have. I would get sort of overwhelmed when I delve into the trauma research and try to understand, like, well, if it's not PTSD, what is trauma? How do I recognize trauma impact? What are the trauma symptoms? And so I finally I finally distilled down the real common trauma symptoms that you'll see at play. Let me just find back where I am, hold on. Okay, so yeah, so this mnemonic device, H lames, it's not completely PC because I use my H to me is harm. Harm lames people. That's the rest. That's how to remember the common symptoms, and I just keep it in my head. Harm lames people. And these are the symptoms that you'll see you'll hear them in client stories. Sometimes, I mean, you'll look at them generally, it defines sort of a whole client's life, and I'll try to give an example of that. But so the real common symptoms you see for people who are trauma survivors could be ACEs, could be adult trauma, could be complex trauma, polyvictimization. The more of it, the more likely you're going to see these symptoms. So hypervigilance, that's sort of being stuck in fight or flight. Clients that can come and be very demanding, trying to provoke you, getting ready, you know, they're going to run. You can't help me, why am I even talking to you? Sort of have one foot in, one foot out. That's often people who are dealing with symptoms of hypervigilance. Low self-esteem. It's weird because low self-esteem is not really a psychiatric symptom that can be treatable, but low self-esteem you'll see in your client, manifest in your client's life, and it impacts the decisions they make, the choices they make, what they'll ask of you. So be aware of low self-esteem. That's a lot of shame, blame, guilt, stigma, feeling powerless or helpless. Avoidance. Avoidance, when people are avoiding, they can be avoiding, like, you know, the street where they were raped. They could be avoiding family members who abused them in their past. They could be avoiding all strange men. They could be, so avoidance, it can come to it can be very specific. I just did a hearing with a client a couple weeks ago who I felt like her whole, over 2,000-page record of a woman struggling with co-occurring mental health symptoms and heroin dependence and cocaine dependence over 9 years' time, that sort of her collective conduct, everything that was going on in her case file was all about avoidance. She didn't want to talk, wasn't prepared to deal with the trauma. She had both childhood trauma, adult trauma. 2 of her toddler children were killed in a fire when she was under the influence. She had really profound trauma, and sort of everything she had set up in her life was about not talking about it. So her interaction with me, she would come in very dramatic and very, I've got this pain and I've got this wrong with me. And it was like every appointment, I felt like we never got to the heart of like what was going on with her case. Everything would be a distraction. And that's when I looked at, after 2,000 pages of interviewing mental health provider and a treating psychiatrist, it was like her whole life was about avoidance. She didn't want anybody getting too close to her. She didn't want anybody pushing her on dealing with her trauma. She just wasn't ready yet. So avoidance can color a whole way of somebody lives. Somebody could be in a homeless shelter to avoid dealing with whatever trauma they have in their background. Isolation, when you find people that are disconnected, they can't cite to a family member or a friend that you could put as a third party, or they say no, I don't have anybody in life. I don't trust anybody. Often isolation if they're estranged from family. Mistrust, people can be very mistrustful, and those clients can be so difficult to engage because they're constantly, they don't believe that you're really going to work for them. They don't believe that you have their best interests at heart. It can be very impactful in the attorney-client relationship. And you'll see it again, it'll be impacting their social relationships. Somatic. Somatic symptoms, I just find, it's not, you don't always see it in the trauma literature, but I think that's because the mental health and physical health sort of, the query is different, but in my work, where I'm constantly reading medical records and working with people that have profound both mental and physical impairments, I find people with trauma histories have a lot of somatic complaints, and there is literature on this, sort of the body keeps score. Whatever your experiences are mentally will be felt physically. And so I have a lot of cases where where people will complain about all this physical ailments they have, and then when I get their medical records, it's like it really doesn't bear out. But they do have significant trauma histories. And in my line of work, in disability proceedings, judges, I read, clients come to me who have just lost at a judge's hearing, in the last year, and I read it, and the judge totally didn't believe any of the client's story about how profound their pain symptoms were, right, and what was wrong with them physically. And that's because the objective medical evidence didn't support that level of pain. But if they'd had their trauma histories developed, if you would have seen that it was actually a somatic complaint, and somatic means where you have, there's no objective medical, or the degree of the complaint of pain or lack of function is beyond what the objective medical evidence would show. So these are the symptoms. If you just keep this H-lines in your head, you'll be like, next time you go to a party, you're like, yeah, I know all about trauma symptoms. You'll be really cool, and it will help you in your work. And I think what it does is, by knowing trauma symptoms, it helps to sort of get in your head, well, what's a trauma-informed response? Being trauma-informed just doesn't come out of the blue. Well, we know about trauma, so let's be trauma-informed. Well, what the heck does that mean? Trauma-informed is about responding to those symptoms that are manifested in our clients and in our client communities. So, so you can just go through the mnemonic H-lambs. And so what is somebody that's impacted by trauma need? They need safety. They need trustworthiness. Collaboration can help people overcome all their broken, fractured relationships. And they need you to be reliable. That's the long and the short of it, and I've got still more time to talk, but a trauma-informed response, or essentially those factors. So you can go, all of our programs and my program, and we're all works in progress. We're all works in progress. My project, myself, every day I am challenged to be a better trauma-informed lawyer. But look at our physical environment. We want to make sure our clients feel safe when they walk in. In terms of an emotional safety, we want to be non-judgmental, invite them to share with us, reassure them that anything shared is confidential, and let them know if there's any exceptions, if you have any, for example, duty report, or you might have to call for emergency psychiatric hospitalization if somebody is absolutely honest with you about how they're feeling. Trustworthiness, you want to be predictable, consistent. Boundary, it doesn't mean you have to be acceptable of what every client says, and clients who are very trauma impacted can be very challenging to work with. Boundaries are important to be laid out, to be clear, and to be consistent about. I used to take phone calls from clients. I'm still a work in progress, but beyond work hours and on weekends, right? But then I realized it's not fair when I only answer that call on the weekend when I've got the wherewithal to deal with it, and not on the next week when I'm so burnt out I really need to recoup. So it's like I have to set my boundaries so that clients always know when it's appropriate to contact me, when I will be available to them. Because we have to look after our own health, and clients need to know they need you to be consistent. That builds trust. Collaborative. I find in my practice, everything is so intensively collaborative. I make options and choices available to my clients, and the client gets to choose how they're going to go. And a lot of clients who have low self-esteem don't want to make those choices, but I try to empower them into being able to, make the choices. And by doing this, you really can help clients build resilience, and that's one of the reasons. I think to be jumping ahead, but to be trauma informed allows you to be a better lawyer, but it also helps your own clients' development in terms of building resilience, which helps immunize them to some extent to the stress of trauma and poor health outcomes of trauma. So reliability, you want to be reliable, repair any disrupted relationships. If you screw up, say you did, apologize, own it, role model for the client that we're all human, we all make mistakes, but you need to repair any disruptive relationship you have with your client, and pass the push-away test. I don't know if you guys are all young lawyers. You may not have been fired yet. You meet a client on a Tuesday who tells you their whole life story, and they call you Wednesday. I don't want you to be my lawyer. You haven't done it. I don't think you really want to help me. And you're like, okay, well, you're so busy. You've got 99 other clients. You can say, okay, well, all right, good luck to you. Or you can try to repair the relationship, recognizing it's the trauma symptom that somebody's actually having a very scared, overwhelmed response. They're being flooded, and you want to repair that relationship. So trauma-informed actions, expressing your concern and support, communicate to clients you're there, you care, and you want to listen. All of my interviews are very open-ended. I don't know how they teach interviewing and counseling in law school anymore, but I think it only needs to be open-ended questions. What can I do for you today? Tell me about what's going on. And I just write. I'm a prolific typer when I work with clients, assuming they're comfortable with it. And I just write really narrative, long stories about what's going on with people. And it's amazing when people are asked questions and allowed to speak how much of their story you'll actually hear. So you want to reassure them that you care about them and their health and their wellness. If they do go into a report of trauma, you want to make sure, I don't really have time to go into it, but I would encourage you as you be trauma informed to get some clinical input into how you can help clients, like be grounded if somebody gets really, really stressed out, like getting their, if they seem to be losing control or getting very emotional, take a step back, stop and breathe, let's feel your feet on the floor, let's touch the desk, let's just let's regroup for a minute. Explain to clients why you're asking questions. It's not just your own prurient interest. You're not just curious, but say, many people who experience trauma have significant medical conditions in adulthood. What has your experience with that? Many people have experienced significant trauma, self-medicate with substances. What has your experience been? Explain to people, and I'm asking because it's relevant, because that can impact, if that's reflected in medical records, it could impact my ability to win your case for you. So explain what you're asking. Again, here is this slide about open-ended questions. I want to get to applying this to cases. But anyway, and you can see this. You all have a printout of the PowerPoint. So open-ended questions where you just, again, ask clients, how do you cope with that? How are you doing? Do you have support around these experiences? How do you feel your trauma impacts you? Do you feel it does anymore? Okay, so let's talk about putting this in action with a real client example. So I met a client last summer at Franciscan Shelter on the West Side. He was in his 40s. He told me he'd been homeless about 3 years. Ever since he was released from Illinois Department 11 years of a 22-year sentence. He was African American. He reported to me he had an 8th or 9th grade education. When I asked him about, what about, you've been in the shelter 3 years, do you have any family or, you know, relatives, anybody that you could turn to for help, for laundry or assistant? I don't want to talk to any of my family. Multiple times in the initial interview, he was sort of, he was quite guarded and reported that he had very, very severe diabetes that was out of control, but to this day, I just want it to be over. I'm just ready for it to be over. And he started out the interviewing saying, I don't know why I'm here, you can't help me, okay? So looking at the poly-victimization trauma checklist, if you look, I think it's page 3 of that handout. So being trauma-informed, now a conventional lawyer might have heard this gentleman's story. So what he said to me is, I've got diabetes, it's not well controlled. I'm homeless, no one will hire me because of my criminal background. He was mortified, he was so embarrassed that he had been, what he really wanted to focus on is that he was in prison for 11 years of a 22-year sentence for a crime he did not commit. He went to trial because it wasn't him. And he thought that was because he was innocent, he would be let off, and he was found guilty and sentenced for it. He just did 11 years, and he'd been homeless ever since. So a conventional lawyer might have said, well, probably the real reason he can't work is because he's got a criminal record, so that, you know, that's a check against his credibility. Diabetes, that's generally a chronic medical condition that can be managed with health, you know, good health care. It's just because he's homeless that's the problem. It's probably not a disabling condition. Well, you go ahead and call me if, why don't you go ahead and apply for disability and call me if it doesn't work out for you, if they even told him to call. So that would be a conventional lawyer's approach. You think? You get anybody working in a legal services office, somebody calls in on intake, I'm 44 with diabetes, no one will hire me because I just came out of corrections 3 years ago. I need disability benefits. Many of your programs would say, good luck with that. So, looking at your trauma symptom checklist, who'd you shout out? Anybody here yet, based on what I told you, any trauma experience? Anybody? We have a quiet crew back there. Do you see any trauma in your checklist? Do you have the handout?
No, I came in late, I'm sorry, but
Okay.
it's really that it's a typical scenario, I would say. Sometimes the females as well have, you know, been exposed to domestic violence or you know, other type of mental abuse and
Right, so
same type of issues.
Anybody else? He's reported to me he's been in a homeless shelter 3 years. Just shout it out.
Significant life challenge.
Louder.
The significant life challenge.
Significant life challenge. Did I get that right? Go. Look at the list. Maybe system-induced trauma. He was wrongfully arrested or wrongfully convicted. He was incarcerated for 3 years for a crime he didn't commit. It's not on the list, but he's a black man in Chicago. That can be significantly traumatizing for somebody who's homeless on the west side, dodging violence every day. He said he had a chronic medical condition, and even if that's not on the list, that is, as you know, an ACE. You know, many people with chronic medical conditions have average life experiences. So I asked him, when anybody reports to me low grade accomplishment, he said, I don't know, I stopped going to school in the 8th or 9th grade. I said, well, that's pretty young to stop going to school. What was going on at that time? He said, well, I was moving from foster home to foster home. Right, so does that add another? So we got another trauma here, right? So he's in foster home. He was dislocated as a youth. He'd been, and so when I asked him, I said, do you recall? Go ahead, shut up.
Avoidance.
Pardon?
Avoidance, he doesn't want to talk to his family.
He did, right. He was totally disconnected with his family. Didn't want to talk to anybody. I also asked him, do you have a case manager, a social worker, anybody you've been working with? He's been homeless 3 years. He said no. So that would be either mistrustful, isolation, right? Avoidance. Avoidance was definitely the family pattern. I asked him if he could recall for me what triggered his entry into the foster care system. And that's when I got, wow. I mean, he just really shut down and sort of abruptly said, there are some things that are not to be talked about. He alluded to a little bit of physical So certainly that was significant trauma, right? So I said to him, and then he kept saying during the interview, I'm just ready for it to be over. You know, I talked to him about, well, we can apply for disability, but I'm just ready for it to be over. So then, all right, so going through this trauma symptom checklist and being trauma informed, I'm like, this guy, anybody who's almost 3 years, not connected with anybody, been in the criminal justice system 11 years, dropped out, was in foster care, this is a trauma survivor. Have you ever been diagnosed with trauma? No. Have you ever been treated with a mental health condition? You said no from the Department of Corrections. The next page on this handout is the symptoms. So, okay, you already know the symptoms, right? So this is just something that you guys can go back and keep in your material. So you can, the symptoms of avoidance. He had attachment problems. I asked him about his sleep. It's sort of hard to judge because in a homeless shelter it can be very difficult to sleep. He certainly had attention, concentration difficulties. So you can get a sense of how severe, how many symptoms are manifest in your client, or if you're reviewing a client record, how many symptoms manifest there. And then this handout has a flow chart of trauma-informed symptoms. So based on Mr. James' presentation to me, being trauma-informed, I heard his story not as I have diabetes and no one will hire me, but I heard his story of what has been his experience in life. He had certainly been profoundly impacted by trauma. He was expressing to me, I'm ready for it to be over, so I had to do a suicide check and make sure that he didn't have a plan. He was not intending to commit suicide. I had to be very explicit with him that what he was sharing with me caused tremendous concern on my part, that he might harm himself. So, and I knew that based on my trauma informed, that this was a client that I needed to hold close to me. I needed to be very reliable to him. He did have a cell phone. I put it in my phone under his name. I scheduled an appointment for Monday to go apply for disability. We started a conversation about, I said to him, it was so, some of the consciousness raising you can do in this area of practice. I said to him, you know, it's not, because he was so embarrassed having dropped out of school. It was like, I feel like a loser because I've never, you know, I dropped out. So again, I said, you know, Mr. James, there's a lot of research nowadays that tells us that kids who are experiencing trauma in childhood have a really hard time learning. So it's not surprising to me that you weren't able to learn in school or achieve in school when you tell me you were moving from foster care home to foster care home. That's a very traumatic experience. And he was like, really? I mean, to give him an alternative, like this was not, it was not his failure. It was not his personal shortcoming, but this was his response to childhood trauma, and to validate to him, like, this is what happened to you is somewhat predictable, and that you're having a difficult time in adulthood with chronic illness and homelessness, and then that additional trauma you had being wrongfully convicted and incarcerated. I recommended that if he would be amenable to it, for me to link him with a mental health outreach worker who was very trauma informed, and I knew would start engaging him to start dealing with the trauma. He was very, very anxious about it, but ultimately at the end really began to work through his trauma symptoms. And interestingly, on that case, I got a call from supervisors down in Springfield on the disability claim who want to deny the case because we developed the mental health angle and the trauma history, and they said because this was the first, his whole history, there was no mental health symptoms reported, so they thought it was fraud. They thought it was making all this stuff up. And I sent a very detailed memo with research saying, no, this is actually a trauma-impacted adult. And I had his mental health worker also write about all the trauma symptoms, and that he was really presenting his textbook, undiagnosed, untreated trauma impact. And we won the case. So that's very exciting. And he's doing better. Not great, he's got a lot of trauma to deal through. We have time. Okay, so another client came to me, was referred by a mental health team at Threshold. He had a disability claim pending for years. He had been denied by a judge, gone to the appeals council, gone to federal court. Federal court had remanded it back and said, judge, you didn't apply the law right. Substance use may be material, but it may not be material, and you need to apply the correct standard. So the mental health team called me because this client's private lawyer, who had worked so hard at the ALJ level all the way to federal court and back, had withdrawn from the case. They didn't tell me why. They said she suddenly withdrew and we didn't know what was going on with this case, and now he's got a hearing date. Can you do something? So when I got the record and got on the case, I read the records, and I learned that the private attorney had withdrawn from the case after she had sent a request to this client, treating psychiatrist, for a letter saying substance use is not material, something to help bolster the disability claim. This client had a diagnosis of depression and alcohol. And you think about, well, alcohol is a depressant. If you're using a lot of alcohol, that's going to impact the depression. Therefore, you're barred from Social Security disability because your real problem is alcohol use, right? So the attorney withdrawn, going, well, I can't possibly win if your treating doctor doesn't think you're disabled, if he thinks alcohol is the problem. And I read that very late on a Sunday night after I reviewed like a couple thousand pages of records. And I was like, aha, well, this is why the other attorney got out of the case. This is going to be a real problem because the psychiatrist's note said in the record, I don't think he's disabled, declined to do the paperwork. And we're going in front of a judge, right? So a private attorney, a conventional attorney might go, nothing I can do, right? But a trauma-informed attorney goes, well, let's look at this a little more deeply. So working with a client, you see that, in fact, he had started out using alcohol at the age of 13. His mom had serious mental illness, very serious, very flagrant psychotic symptoms, and embarrassed my client very much when he was a young man. My client was bullied when he was in elementary school, in part because of his mom, but also in part because he was slow. And third, his dad had abandoned the family and started a new family when he was in childhood. So he had some significant trauma, and what he reported is because of his mom's symptoms. When my client started drinking as a young boy and staying in bed instead of going to school, mom didn't do anything. Mom sort of liked the company, right? So my client, knowing what the impact of adverse childhood experience is, what did he do? He started adapting to that stressful environment by drinking. And when you start adapting at that young of an age, that's the only skills that he had was how to drink to get through the day. And now he was in his 40s, he had reduced, he was in a harm reduction MISA program. So he had reduced his alcohol use, but not stopped drinking it completely. So working with the social work team, his MISA team, I talked to them. Now they felt, the social workers felt, he would be disabled whether he drank alcohol or not. We went to the hearing, I did the trauma development in the brief, established that he would lack the adaptive, because of his trauma history and his long history with substance use, he lacked the adaptive skills to be in any work environment, even a simple unskilled job. He wouldn't be able to adapt. He simply never learned healthy coping and adaptive skills to stress. And we won that case, and he won like $60,000 and traveled around the country before he settled back down here. He was very, very happy about that. My last 30 seconds, another client I sort of alluded to earlier, who she had wanted to fire her private attorney at a big disability law firm, because every time she called in, she had to talk to a different case manager. So that really, really triggered her issues of trust. She was very young. She had a very serious mental illness. She had a history of pot use. She came to me identified as a trauma survivor, highly impacted by trauma. She had applied 4 times and never gotten disability benefits. Had anybody ever requested her to close DCFS file, they would have seen the most awful, awful early childhood trauma that this young woman had survived. And anyway, really important to this client was how she would interact with me. She didn't want to answer any questions, so I was able to, again, just get her to sign releases. That's fine, you don't have to share your story with me. Let me gather any records where I can learn about your background, learn about what you've gone through. She did not want to testify in front of the judge, so we did a ton of development with her social worker and with the client to have everything set. So the client just had to go into the hearing to establish her identity and really to let the client lay some the judge asked some foundational questions about, she's for real. And then I asked that she be excused. And we were able to litigate the case without her present. And she waited in the waiting room. And we were able to walk out and say, you won. And she was so grateful and validated that, and this experience that she was so afraid of. She was firing her private attorney. She was done. She was not going to go because it was triggering so many symptoms in her. But we were able to do it by saying, that's cool. You stay where you are when you recover. You work with your social worker. You take care of your health. You focus on being stable in the community, and we'll do the rest. So trauma-informed lawyer. More clients will get through your case acceptance schedule. You'll have better outcomes. You're going to win cases that conventional lawyers might lose. You'll have a better attorney-client relationship. And you're going to foster resilience in your clients, which protects against the long-term effect of trauma. Every positive relationship with people who have experienced trauma, every positive relationship, period, makes the world a better place, right? But every positive experience with people who have experienced trauma helps to cultivate resilience and healing and recovery, and that's a worthy goal. So, you guys are all young. I'm going to retire in 15 more years. So please integrate trauma research into your practice. I think it's really impactful. I can't tell you how important. I would like to see every human service system in our country be trauma-informed. You can walk into a shelter in Chicago that's trauma-informed and have a completely different experience than walking into a homeless shelter that's not trauma-informed. Same thing is true for our schools, healthcare settings, our justice settings, everything. You know, you can be in some of the institutions in which we practice, they are so hostile to and adverse to our clients' life experience and expectations and hopes and needs at that point in time, and we really, really, really need to be robust in our understanding of trauma, our integration of trauma into our practice, and our effective representation of clients. Thank you, I did that in an hour.